I start today's episode with a story, a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment that has been elevated almost to the level of a parable in AI circles. It's the story of A Very Special Room, published in 1980 by John Searle of the Department of Philosophy at UC Berkeley. The story has many variants even within the original paper, but I will present the simplest here. Inside of this room are 3 books and a native English speaker who understands and reads no Chinese. In the door to this room, there is a slot for messages coming in and out. Inside of the room, there is the table with the 3 books. These 3 books look very similar to the person inside the room. In each book, there are squiggles and lines with associated reference numbers. The person in the room is also given a set of instructions written in English, which he does speak, with rules to match a reference number in book number 1 with a reference number in book number 2, and similarly, a set of rules to match a reference number in book number 2 to a reference number in book number 3. The person in the room has a job. When he receives a piece of paper through the slot in the door, he carries it to book number 1. The paper is filled with slashes and squiggles and other similar shapes, and he goes through book number 1 to find the slashes and squiggles that match those on the paper. He then follows the first set of rules, remember these rules are written in English, to match what he finds in book number 1 with what he finds in book number 2, and then another set of rules to match these with book number 3. Finally, he copies down the squiggles from book number 3 in order on his sheet of paper and passes that sheet of paper out the slot in the door. He is proficient at this job, and he spends his days receiving pieces of paper and pushing pieces of paper he has written through the slot in the door. On the other side of the door is a native Chinese speaker who writes questions about a particular story onto a sheet of paper and passes them through the slot. He then receives answers to his questions about this story written on sheets of paper that are passed back through the slot to him. The designers of this system have special jargon for the books on the table, the sheets of paper going in and out of the slot, and the set of English instructions the person in the room is given. The 3 books are referred to as script, story, and answers. The piece of paper are, of course, called input and output, and the rules written in English are known as the program. Let's reflect upon this for a second. The Chinese user obviously understands Chinese, but in the black box that is this Chinese room, who understands Chinese? It's not the man in the room whom we've already described as not knowing a word of Chinese written or spoken. Who then? Does the room understand Chinese? And if the man in the room does not understand Chinese, how is he giving answers about the story? Who understands the story? Is it again the room? Do the books understand the story? Do the rules speak Chinese? This was a fascinating thought experiment and was a lot of fun to debate until November 30th, 2022, when ChatGPT was launched. Now each of us has his own Chinese room. I'm Josh Young, and this is Playing Odd, a podcast about complexity and information in the natural world. Episode 12, Artificial Intelligence. Artificial intelligence encompasses a large number of approaches, and I want to confine our discussion to algorithms that require training. It's difficult to imagine any other sort of artificial intelligence now, but you'll remember we discussed symbolic logic and Marvin Minsky and the AI winter that resulted from Minsky's criticism of neural networks. When we think of artificial intelligence, we think of algorithms that require training. Convolutional neural networks can be trained on a series of images in order to distinguish shoes and watches and hammers, or to distinguish different sorts of pathology that are identifiable on radiologic, micrographic, or optical tomographic images. The pixels of the image are arranged, often linearized, and given as input to the neural network. The neural network does calculations on these pixels and then categorizes the image. Its accuracy in categorization is assessed, and variables within the algorithm are altered based upon the accuracy of the output of the neural network. Other sorts of machine learning work in analogous ways. The training data consists of images or other sorts of data that have already been labeled by humans with a correct characterization. For example, the training set might contain pictures of lions and of dogs, with pictures of lions being labeled by humans as lion, and the pictures of dogs being labeled by humans as dogs. We refer to these labeled data as real-world evidence, and we assess the ability of the AI algorithm to assign the correct label to the images it is given. Then we alter the variables within the algorithm to guide it to the correct answer. This is called training. The algorithm is then exposed to another set of labeled data of real-world evidence that it has not seen before. In the parlance of AI, we say that we are showing it data to which it is naive. We then grade the algorithm on its ability to correctly label these new data, and based upon how it does, we can say whether the algorithm performs well or not. We call this stage validation. This, by now, should be very reminiscent of apoptosis and neuroplasticity, in which an initial architecture is built and then is modified based upon exposure to outside data. In the abstract, we can say that the algorithm is developing a model of the sort of data to which it is exposed. This model is limited to the subject matter on which the algorithm is trained. Algorithms trained to detect prostate cancer develop internal models only of prostate cancer images. They have nothing to say about the stock market or neurodevelopment. For the sake of this discussion, I'm going to refer to the algorithm's model of the data on which it is trained as a world model, understanding well that this world is generally very limited. This has some parallels to our own neurodevelopment, but it also has some important differences. The only interaction between the algorithm and the data is one way. We acquire some of our information in a one-way manner, but our foundational knowledge is more interactive. We learn how to manipulate objects. Indeed, we learn of objects' properties by handling them as infants and toddlers. We learn through our senses in a largely bidirectional manner. Even our senses of smell and vision, which seem to be entirely unidirectional, are, of course, highly modified by our movement through space. As we walk around, the image obtained by our eyes, even in a static environment, changes. The same is true of smell and of hearing. It is through this two-way interaction with our environment that synaptic weights get changed. There are several profound implications that arise from this simple fact. One of them is that our neurodevelopment is inextricably linked to our senses. In his seminal paper of 1980, Thomas Nagel asks the question, what is it like to be a bat? Nagel makes the point that it is impossible for us to understand a world that is perceived through echolocation. That is to say, the sensory apparatus is strongly linked to the type of intelligence that is built with its assistance. Much ink has been spilled on discussions of sensory experiences or qualia, and these are of great importance in consciousness, but I'm afraid this podcast is not the right forum for that sort of discussion. In the much more atomistic analysis in which we have been engaged, we can say that the world model of the AI is entirely dependent upon the sort of data on which it is trained, and if that data is echolocation rather than photographic, the AI will build a world model based upon echolocation. If the AI is built upon data, and data is acquired ultimately through sensors, would it make more sense to incorporate the sensors into the AI itself? Indeed, this is a fertile area of research in the field of robotics and is referred to as embodied intelligence. In practice, a traditionally trained AI model is built, and then additional modifications are made by employing what is called reinforcement learning through sensory interaction between the embodied AI and its environment. This parallels the brain development that we've discussed, in which some neurologic processes are pre-built in those areas that are sometimes called our reptile brain, and other areas, such as the neocortex, are greatly modified by interaction with our environment. See episode 10. This can result in a much broader world model than is obtained through traditional convolutional neural networks. But I want to stress again that this is a world model that is constructed out of sensory data. And if that sensory data are echolocation or optical polarization or detection of magnetic fields, a facility that's present in some birds, then the world model will be entirely alien to those constructed in human neurodevelopment. Ultimately, it is impossible to separate an intelligence from the world in which it is built. One of the lessons of episode 10 is that neurodevelopment is inseparable from the outside world. One of the corollaries of this episode should be that the brain is inseparable from the body and its senses. But what of large language models like ChatGPT and its ilk? They seem to know everything. To understand what's going on here, we need to return to our Chinese room. Remember, our Chinese room consisted of books, a non-Chinese speaking person, and a set of rules that told the person how to gather information from the books. We asked the question, who in the system knows Chinese? Is it the books or the rules, or unwittingly the person? The answer to the question is that none of these entities knows Chinese. When you use a calculator, do you believe that the calculator knows mathematics? Of course not. The calculator has a set of rules that it executes to produce an answer, and to the extent that we can say that the calculator knows anything, it knows these rules. Similarly, in the Chinese room, the translation is not done by the books, which are a static database, or the person who is the CPU in the system, but it is rather done by the set of rules or the algorithm. I don't think that there's any cognitive leap here in saying that the algorithm is performing the translation. But that is quite different from saying that the algorithm knows Chinese. The real questions are about how this algorithm was produced. One way that we know to produce such an algorithm is through the training of an AI. This training involves exposing the AI to labeled data and then modifying the AI until it gets things right. The people who know Chinese are the people who label the data on which the AI is trained. So the answer to who in the system of the Chinese room knows Chinese is the people or person who produced the data on which the algorithm was trained. It's really not that much of a mystery. In our earlier example of a convolutional neural network able to distinguish dogs from lions, we can ask, who actually knows about dogs and lions? The answer is the humans who label the initial training set. The algorithm has developed a world model consisting of three things: dog, lion, and other. We cannot say that the algorithm understands what a dog is any more than we can say that the algorithm of the Chinese room understands Chinese, but it is able to categorize images within this greatly simplified world model. What about the LLM, the large language model? ChatGPT seems to know about lions and about dogs. Does this mean that the LLM has a world model that encompasses all of the objects of the actual world? To explore this question, we need to ask, as we did with the Chinese room and in the case of the lion and dog algorithm, what is the nature of the training data? The training data for large language models is vast and consists of much of what exists on the internet. Most of this, initially all of it, consisted of text written by humans. These humans, as do all living organisms, exhibit embodied intelligence. We learn about our world by being in it. We can then describe the world, if we are adept at composing written language, in the form of text. The text is therefore at least one step removed from the initial sensory data. And it is this text on which the LLM is trained. The LLM's world model is not a model of the world as we perceive it, but a model of the world as we describe it. The LLM cannot predict anything of the world itself. It can only predict description. Let's try to make this more concrete by re-examination of the Chinese room. If we were to build 1,000 or 100,000 Chinese rooms and then collect the algorithms from each of these rooms and then train an AI on those algorithms, that AI would be akin to an LLM. That AI would not only be good at translating Chinese, but in creating a world model of the sorts of rules required to translate Chinese. The LLM could discuss the particular ways the Chinese language describes things, and if the LLM were also trained on 100,000 English rooms and 100,000 Swahili rooms, the LLM could discuss in detail the ways in which different languages divide things like color and taste and motion and other ways in which languages can differ. But the LLM does not understand these languages and has not built a model of the world in the way that we do. It has built a model of the rules of these rooms. What is the distinction here? What is the difference between having a world model that includes a Chinese description of a broken glass and having a world model that incorporates broken glasses? Certainly to the user of the LLM, it can be very hard to distinguish the two. But there are difficulties in generalizing the world model the LLM has created outside of its training set. And there are issues as well in understanding causality. And this is because the descriptions of the world are based on text that has already been filtered through our own sense of what is relevant and what is not. In the room in which I sit, a computer beeps, there's heavy machinery outside, the room is warm, there are footsteps on the stairs, my walls are yellow, my coffee cup is empty, the surface of the desk is chipped, my speakers are dusty, it is Tuesday, just afternoon, and the mirror is tilted. Almost none of this information is relevant to each other, and most writing, even very descriptive writing, is not as laden with irrelevance as the information that flows through our senses. We have already filtered out irrelevant detail when we write our text. The result is that LLMs are very bad at determining what is relevant. If we give the LLM the description of the room I have mentioned, it will connect all the parts into a single narrative and will discard nothing. This highlights the point that the LLM does not have a world model of the actual world, but simply has a world model consisting of our descriptions. The LLM is very good at predicting descriptions, but it has no first-hand knowledge of the world through its own sensors and has no sense of association, relevance, or causality. In order to overcome this, there are research efforts to allow LLMs to interact with the world. For example, some AIs are trained to ask questions and then to employ reinforcement learning to adjust the weights in their models in order to incorporate the information generated by this interaction. LLMs have also begun to incorporate the ingestion of pictures. These pictures are a sort of primary sensory data. After all, I believe that I know what dinosaurs look like, and yet I've never seen one myself. My information comes from pictures too. However, because of our interactions with the world, we are able to generalize information we obtain from pictures a great deal better than can computers. I have created very compelling slides using AI-generated animation of still pictures. But some of the motion that AI produces from these pictures is physically impossible and reveals a lack of understanding on the AI's part. By manipulating objects, by walking through space and seeing how objects in the world change as I move around them, I can generalize and imagine what a view of a dinosaur would be, even if I've never seen that particular perspective in a drawing. Perhaps embodied intelligence in the form of robots that can move around in real space and manipulate objects will allow such generalizations in the future, again, emphasizing the ultimate inseparability of an intelligence from the physical world in which it is embedded and through which it senses the world. I have two other points to make about LLMs. The first is that, trained upon the writings of humans, they incorporate all the biases we discussed in episode 11. I know that I have just a minute or two ago criticized LLMs for not understanding causality, but you will recall linear causality is not the way much of the world works. LLMs mimic text that describes the world of objects rather than of processes and largely ignores the rich interdependence of the agents of which the world is composed. My final point about LLMs, and almost all artificial intelligence, is that it itself is built around a linear process. It is a program, and as a program, it does calculations in a linear order. In an AI, this order may have iterative loops, there may be feed forward and feed backward, and it may have elements of parallel calculation, but ultimately it is a single process. As wonderful and complicated as these AIs are, they are not complex. They are massively complicated agents, but they are, in the end, unitary entities that do not interact with each other. The best that such AIs will be able to achieve is a mimicry of human understanding of the world. An alternative approach is agent-based modeling, in which different algorithms interact with each other. It is here that we can expect to see new emergent properties that are not present in the algorithms of the individual agents. The degree of computation required to model the interaction of multiple interdependent algorithms is mind-boggling. My AI colleagues can attest to the fact that the speed at which algorithms can be trained is largely dependent upon computational resources. Each bacterial cell can produce thousands of different enzymes and a multitude of copies of each. Even if each of these enzymes runs a simple algorithm, the real-time computation is enormous. And this is for a single bacterial cell. Eukaryotic cells are much more complicated, and the infant's brain contains 100 billion neurons, to say nothing of glial cells and other tissues with which neurons interact and interdepend. It is no wonder that the Human Brain Project found itself over its head. Efforts do exist to incorporate the ideas of complexity science into AI architecture, and as computation technology continues to blossom, we will one day have the resources to create systems that will demonstrate power and flexibility, and perhaps most importantly, emergence. We are living in a very special time. Dear listener, this is the end of our story. I've enjoyed your company more than I can describe. I hope this podcast has opened your eyes as it has mine, and I wish you many hours of fruitful contemplation. I'm Josh Young.